All right, welcome back. Now, another soon-to-be brilliant talk. We'll have Jack. I thought if I could call you Love because I just thought it would be nice, but no. Jack Lowe, who will talk about something as lovely as a safer Swede. Right, yes. Welcome. Cheers.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jack Lowe. Today I'll be presenting my paper, which is soon to be published, titled A Safer Sweden, Using Narrative Analysis to Understand the Rise in Sweden's Prison Population. I'm so thrilled to be here. I'm a proud member of the very first cohort of the Cultural Criminology program, along with Filippa and Natalia, if she's in here somewhere. So I'm super happy. I owe a big thanks to Eric and Sebastian, and then a thank you to David for allowing me to share the stage with such talented academics today. So I'll start with a quick overview. In this paper, I analyze formal accounts of punishment, identifying the shifts in the cultural conditions which drive Swedish penal policy. The collective identities that I found throughout the data set demonstrate the dichotomous relationships between the gang criminal, who is depicted as the foreign criminal other, who is juxtaposed against the ordinary Swede. This highlights who penal policy is targeted towards. The three intervention narratives that I identify, which are expansion, tough on crime, and border control narratives, open a window into how crime control is meant to be carried out. And then finally, logic narratives help us to understand why, explaining the rationale that inspires the strategies imposed and implemented. These logics also help us connect themes proliferating Swedish politics with crime control strategies from other countries, namely the United States, to better understand how stories travel and adapt to new cultural contexts. So as I'm sure by now, my distinct New Jersey accent has given away the fact that I am not a native Swede. So you may be wondering what I am doing here talking about Swedish penal policy. So when I was in undergrad, I studied prisons in the United States, and I became fascinated with this idea of Nordic penal exceptionalism. So much so that I decided I needed to come out here and see it for myself. So for Nordic exceptionalism, the idea for me as an American that here in Sweden, prison was not meant for punishment. It was meant to make people better. I was captivated by the narrative that lawbreakers in Sweden are, quote, orphans of the Swedish people's home, who need to be rehabilitated and brought back into the fold. And then I got out here to Lund, and I walked straight into a moral panic about crime and immigration. So I remember specifically going down to Svedala and speaking to people who had organized a referendum vote to block the construction of a new prison in their town. And I was so shocked because I heard them speak about Malmö and the people there in the same ways that I'd heard people talk about poor Black communities in America. And it was right here in black and white that Swedes were supposed to have gotten rid of the stigma around incarcerated people in prisons and found a way to benefit. But what I was seeing with my own eyes was not quite matching what was on the paper. So some scholars argue that Nordic prisons are still exceptional because small open prisons like Halden prison in Norway would be just as unacceptable in the United States as our large prisons with poor conditions would be in Norway. However, I think that there's much that's lost in this analysis, and what my paper argues is that stories about crime are transferable in ways that material structures are not. And it is stories which are shaping the cultural conditions that are the underpinning of any country's system of punishment. So the data that I use in the term A Safer Sweden comes from a collection of publications from the government offices of Sweden under the title A Safer Sweden. For my research, I analyzed 397 publications in this collection published between February 2013 and March 2021. And what made this data set such a good fit for my research is because it doesn't just include all of the publications from the Ministry of Justice or all of the changes to Swedish Penal Code. It's a specifically identified collection of which documents represent what we're doing to create a safer and more secure Sweden. But the focus is almost solely on gang crime. So for me, the fact that the government chooses only to discuss fighting gang crime as a measure of increasing security and excludes other types of crime, for example, sexual violence, domestic violence, drunken driving, is in itself tremendously significant. And these insights make the data set perfect for understanding how criminal justice institutions construct the idea of security and the characters which threaten and protect it. So for my methods, narrative analysis and the traditions of narrative criminology were central to my methodology. And while narrative criminologists often examine firsthand accounts told by victims or harm doers, the stories in my data function very differently. So I use Louise Presser's concept of rhetorical restraint, which focuses on the way that technical stories, specifically social theories that are found often in the data, tend not to call themselves stories or be understood as stories because the narrators are avoiding dramatic statements and they're using their social positioning to craft their narratives as matters of fact. So despite the muted rhetoric, theory stories are able to communicate strong messages about big concerns with very small rhetorical moves. And I'm very happy to be joined here by some giants of the culture of the narrative criminology space. So the results section of my paper is shaped by this idea that policy narratives construct a specific reality and then call for action upon that constructed reality. So the first step in the creation of a policy narrative is the creation of a policy problem, which is usually done through identifying a target population. The narratives in this paper construct two dichotomous identities. The first point of reference is the ordinary Swede, which is often used synonymously with society. And society and the ordinary Swede are both the innocent victims of crime, but also the people who need to stand up to and fight against crime. Next, the binary opposite is the gang criminal. And from my coding process, the gang criminal was not only the most common theme in this data set, but it also appeared more than twice as often as the second most prominent theme. So with sensationalized images of urban violence and inner city crime, as well as statements such as organized crime present a serious threat to democratic society, and we can show that society is stronger than the gangs, the gang members are constructed as the foreign criminal other rather than as orphaned children who are meant to be just like us. So in discussion of gang crime is obviously notorious for coded references and coded language and muted racial inferences. So stereotypes of African and Middle Eastern immigrants are reified through an emphasis on policing border areas and vulnerable communities. The second step in the policy narrative is establishing the cause of crime. And this is done in this data set mainly through illusion and the fact that it focuses specifically on gang crime, reinforcing the links between the immigrant and the gang criminal and thus linking crime to immigration. And then finally, once the target population is established, the crime population to be solved and the cause of the crime problem, the final step is establishing policy interventions that are going to solve this problem. So in the data set, as I mentioned already, the three main policy interventions are expansion, tough on crime, and border control narratives, which for me as an American are very easy to spot and identify, but it's not something that I expect to see in Swedish criminal policy. So I don't get yanked off the stage. I'm gonna go pretty quick through these so I can get to my discussion. But expansion narrative is pretty simple. The idea that the way that you solve a rise in crime is through more police officers and more money for penal institutions. Tough on crime narratives are the way that you solve crime is by longer, harsher prison sentences, and they also include a heightened rhetoric, fighting against crime, combating crime, hunting down criminals, and locking them behind bars. And it's important to state that it is not possible to say that prison is not for punishment in Sweden, it's for rehabilitation, and then to also say we're gonna hunt down gang criminals and lock them behind bars. Those two things can't be true at the same time. The final narrative, which I find the most interesting, is border control narratives. So this is not only about policing Sweden's physical external border, but it's also about policing the imagined community's internal border. And one of the most stark ways that this happens is through discussions of honor-related violence. Very specific mentions of honor killings, female genital mutilation, and child marriages. They function to construct the perpetrators as evil, backwards, and sick, and to ascribe these values to communities of African and Middle Eastern immigrants, which deepens the polarization between the ordinary Swede and the immigrant. In the discussion section, I'll move on here to the why, looking at the big picture as to why these changes are made and what they're trying to achieve. So I call these logic narratives. The first type of logic narrative that we find are traditional Western crime control logics that are reconfigured for acceptance into the Swedish context. The other type is traditionally Swedish crime control narratives, which are used to supplement expansionist ideas. So individual responsibility narratives that you traditionally find in the Western penal context emphasize ideas like deterrence and just desserts, and they can be found in some of the most infamous crime control strategies in the United States. The traditional Swedish crime control narrative comes from the correctionalist tradition. They emphasize alternatives to incarceration, rehabilitation, and more exclusionary punishment working within, or more inclusionary punishment working within the welfare state. So while there are some mentions to welfare and rehabilitation, they no longer hold a dominant or hegemonic position within Swedish crime control. They do, however, ensure that narratives which usually would not fit within the Swedish self-image are recognized and accepted in this new cultural context. Since welfare and rehabilitation still hold a strong place in the criminological beliefs of most Swedes, symbolic mentions of these things are used to frame expansionist policies through the traditional Swedish values of the welfare state. The best example of this is Malmö's deadly violence prevention program called Stop Shooting. As we can see in narratives which talk of focusing on individual responsibility, saying things like the majority of all serious crime can be linked to a few individuals. To reduce violence in society, society must direct its resources towards these individuals and send a clear message that their actions have consequences. They'll also include things that say, but it also sends a clear message that society wants well and there are options for people who want to leave gangs. And so there's a duality here. There's a focus is on the individual's responsibility to not commit crime and the individual's responsibility to opt into defector programs like we heard about earlier. Instead of rehabilitation being universally offered to people who commit crimes, it's something that the individual has the responsibility to seek out, and if they don't seek it out, then they'll be hunted down and punished harshly. There's an incongruent and kind of paradoxical coexistence of rehabilitation and tough on crime narratives here. They work together to legitimize and soften harsh sanctions in the mind of the Swedish public while subordinating social causes of crime to individual responsibility narratives. The marriage of these two types of narratives is not a coincidence. The Stop Shooting program in Malmö is specifically modeled off of an American focused deterrence program called Group Violence Intervention. And in Jennifer Fleetwood's call to look deeper into how stories travel, she talks about how spectacularly mobile American stories about crime are. The data set describes a pair of trips that were taken to Sweden by American gang violence intervention experts, and then another trip from Sweden to New York by the Minister of Justice and the Minister of the Interior. In what Louis Kant would call these carceral excursions, American crime narratives are disseminated to Sweden. Then, as we can see this quote here, they recognize the need to adapt these narratives to the Swedish cultural context, and then to bring it all full circle, they are formalized as theory stories, given justification from the social positioning. So we don't understand it as a story, we understand this as a matter of fact. And so to finish off where I started, at the foundation of this idea of Nordic exceptionalism is the idea that inclusive Nordic prisons are made possible by Nordic cultures of equality. The changing meaning of security, the villainization of the foreign criminal other, and the increased segregation and inequality in Nordic societies suggest the first step away from that culture of equality. And although the statistics may still be drastically different, the emerging prominence of calls for harsh punishments against the racialized other suggests that criminal justice in Sweden is becoming more like the West and more like America than we'd probably all like to believe. Thank you. I hope I was within the time. I know I was close.
All right. A couple of questions for Jack.
Are there any stories going the other way? Like
There are a few examples that I've seen. I know, like in Minnesota specifically, there's been attempts to try to take Nordic prison models to America, but it's far less common than the stories coming this way. And that's why I came here. I was like, this sounds great. Like we should do this in America. But the cases of that are far less than of it going the other way. And I think it's because of like the cultural prominence and the status that American stories have. And in Wakan's paper, he also talks about like these powerful think tanks and organizations that are exporting conservative and punitive ideas about crime to Europe and other places around the world. Which I don't think that Swedes have powerful NGOs trying to export these exceptionalist ideas to America.
Okay, David, go ahead.
Very briefly, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I would just wanted to mention Hanna Sabin Gilja.
Yes.
You know about her?
Yes.
Yeah, and then she was, or maybe you mentioned her and I didn't know.
Yeah, no, I was trying to go so fast, so I didn't quite reference this presentation as well as possible. Yeah. But I do reference her in the paper that I wrote in the look of the meaning of insecurity.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Fear of crime and also the import of actually questionnaires from the United States into the Scandinavian and Swedish context. So I think it's very much in line with your research.
No, it absolutely is. Yeah, I have a lot to learn from her. Yeah, so.
Thanks a lot. I just wanted to mention, in terms of exporting stuff, don't underestimate the Nordic countries' sort of ideas about how brilliant we are. And as Kjersti Lund, who's a professor at University of Oslo, one of the science colleagues, like she studies exactly that, how we as well try to sort of export the beauty of the Nordic exceptionalism, which is not always that beautiful. So there's kind of like there's a lot of work on that. A last comment. Of course, like Sweden has always been American. Think about how many sort of crime policies that that originate from the US, like going back to the Prohibition Age and onwards. So there's like a long history of that. A second point is the sort of difference between the narrative script and what actually happens. Because Sweden is now planning, I can say, to get Europe's biggest prison population. Yeah. That is sort of what they want. $100+ billion is what they want to spend on becoming American. Have the world, like the Europe's biggest prison population. The thing is, it's not going to happen, right? So it's more talk than reality. Same with, like, you had the border image. If you cross the border, as I do almost every day, if my boss asks me, which is not true, I must stay in Copenhagen. They're rarely there, right? Almost never. So there is something about sort of what is narrative and what sort of translated into reality, where I would say a lot of this is more sort of crime policy theatre, because they cannot, they want more and more police officers, but the police officers are quitting and they can't recruit them. They want to expand the prison system, but they can't recruit stuff, and they don't have the money to do it either. Yeah. Even though they say so, right? So there's something, even, I don't know if it's worse or better or whatever, right? But there's something about the rhetoric, and then the reality, where there's a weird schism.
And that's why, so my paper, I use specifically John Pratt, who kind of popularized the Nordic exceptionalism thesis. He says that he is studying formal accounts of punishment. So how countries talk about, this is how we are going to punish. And before I got here, I read stories in The Guardian and other English newspapers of the Director General of Criminal Varden saying these things. Prison is not for punishment in Sweden, it's to make people better. The way that we have security is not by more people in prison, it's as small as prison population as possible. And this is 2013 and 2014 that he's saying these things. And I'm getting here in 2019, less than 5 years old, and it's completely changed, right? And so when looking at narratives and stories, it's what are you saying about yourself? What are you saying that you want to do? And then what you're actually doing and what's happening is a whole different conversation. But yeah.
But to wrap it all up, right? We disappointed you when coming.
I've loved it here. I've loved it here. I've loved it here. So it wasn't what I expected to find, but I loved it nonetheless.
I'm sorry,
So.
we're going to have to move on. So save your, sorry about that. But save your comments and questions, and we'll meet up in the lobby afterwards at some point, and then I'm sure you will be able to answer some more questions now.
Of course.
Thanks a lot, Jack. Moving on. And now we have, I was about to say, stupid Elon. Jonathan Lund.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I might need your help to find the.
You send it to me, right?